Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. On behalf of Right to Freedom, it's a pleasure to see our panelists here and to welcome all of you virtually. We'll get started in a minute with introductions and into our program. But first, I would invite Ambassador Bill Milam, the President of Right to Freedom, to deliver some welcoming remarks. So, Bill, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here again. This is our fourth or fifth public event of the semester, I guess you'd call it, and we've kept doing, I think, pretty well. We're very glad to see the attendees at this webinar, and I think because of the participants and the speakers in particular, it's going to be a very good one. So I'm very happy that all of you made it here, and I welcome you on behalf of the Right to Freedom. And I think I'm looking forward to a very, very good discussion. So I'll turn it back to you, John.
Great, thank you. So just to start with some ground rules, our plan for today is to have this program go for about 90 minutes. Each of our speakers will provide some introductory remarks, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer and some discussion. Since we're in the webinar format, we won't be able to see any of our participants or our attendees online, nor will the chat function be enabled for them. So if you have questions, if you're in the audience, please use the Q&A function, the button on the bottom of your screen. We'll collate the questions and then we'll present those to our presenters after everyone's had a chance to speak. Just a reminder, the event today is being recorded and is being live streamed, and the video recording will be available afterwards. When it comes to question and answer, I know that some of these issues are very sensitive. If you want to remain anonymous as a questioner, that's certainly acceptable. However, if you want to identify yourself and your organization, we'd welcome that, and we'll certainly announce that too. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Mushfiq Fazal Ansari, who will introduce today's panelists. So Mushfiq, over to you.
Thank you, John. It is my distinct privilege to introducing our distinguished panelists for the webinar, Bangladesh's Contentious Election Pathway and Trajectories. And I'm starting from Faisal Mahmood, a Dhaka-based journalist covering Bangladesh for international outlets such as Al Jazeera and TRT World. Faisal's focus on social and political affairs, including extensive coverage of the Rohingya crisis, showcases commitment to responsible journalism, and has earned him prestigious fellowship from Jefferson Adoner and Thomson Reuters Foundation Fellowship. And we have Caroline Nash, Asia Advocacy Director for Amnesty International USA. Caroline brings a wealth experience from her work in Myanmar, Indonesia, East Timor, Kenya, and Uganda. Her dedication to human rights and youth-led initiatives is evident in her diverse background and leadership role. And we have a very distinguished panel speaker right now, Professor Dr. Rashid Al Mahmood Titomir, Professor of Economics at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Chairman of the Department of Development Studies. Rashid's comprehensive career spans academia, government, think tank, and media. His authored works contribute significantly to the understanding of fiscal and monetary policies in development countries, including Bangladesh. And we had John Sifton, Asia Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. John's extensive career has focused on South and Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East, and global terrorism issues. His dedication to human rights, demonstrated since 2001 at Human Rights Watch, highlights his commitment to justice. And we are proud to have our president, Ambassador William B. Milam, a career diplomat who served as the ambassador to Bangladesh and Pakistan. Ambassador Milam played a pivotal role during Bangladesh's strides towards democracy in the early 90s. His distinguished career includes diplomatic posts in Libya and Liberia, contributing the resolution of conflicts, and he established of democracy and elected and the establishment of the democratically elected governments. And our moderator, today's moderator, and R2F board member, John Dunwich, a retired senior foreign service officer with 32 years of experience at the US Department of State. He diverse roles, including Deputy Chief of Mission and Consul General, along with his insightful writings on South Asia and global affairs, make him a fitting moderator for this critical discussion on Bangladesh's electoral landscape. Thank you, John. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mushfiq, and thanks to you and the team for your efforts in putting together today's program. Without further ado, I'll hand the baton to Faisal Mahmood, who will open up today's discussion with an overview of where we are as elections approach on January 7th. So Faisal, to you.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be among this August gathering. I think I'll speak as a reporter because I have been seeing what's happening in the ground. I'll start with an example. Like I just came back from a trip to the southern part of Bangladesh with a foreign correspondent who I'm working with for the past 10 days. And he came to Bangladesh to report on 3 issues. And one of those issues were the politics and election. The strange thing is, after doing the groundworks and the news report and the information that he gathered, he sent this to his news desk, and his news desk says that there is no point of going forward with this report because it seems like that there is not going to be a proper election. So they killed the story. So, I mean, I was disappointed because I was working with him for all these days and we talked with all these people. Now there is not going to be any story in that media. I think that's good for that media because they're not giving coverage to something what can be called, well, it is anything but an election at this point. But it's bad for Bangladesh, right? I mean, the things that is happening here in Bangladesh, it's not being covered in reputed foreign media. It's not good for us because the things that are happening to the opposition camps, it needs to be covered, right? I think since last December 10, I'm in Bangladesh, and they have staged quite a few number of protests, and they have been able to gather a lot of supporters behind their protest. But what happened after October 28 is very sad for our democracy because I can guarantee you that I've talked with a lot of opposition supporters and activists, and it's very hard for them to stay even in their own homes because they're being hounded by the police officers and law enforcers and others, and they're in hiding. Even you see that the top leaders and even the mid-level leaders of BNP are now languishing in jail. So even when I was looking for someone to give comments for our reports, I didn't find anyone outside the jail. So, but then again, when I talk with the Awami League leaders and Awami League, I would say Awami League politicians and stalwarts, they have very good and ready reply on their behalf. They say that the BNP leaders and activists are being sent to jail not because of their political ideology. They are being sent to jail because they took part in vandalism and arson. And I mean, as a reporter, I have to report their quotes, and that you can't deny that because they have made a very concrete logic that they didn't arrest anyone for their political ideology. They gave example like they allowed BNP to have multiple protests from December 10 up until October 28. But on October 28, the protests turned violent and they were engaged in arson and vandalism. And because of that, they are being arrested. So you have very good replies from the ruling party. And you just can't deny that. But then again, I mean, if you look at the way Awami League has been doing politics in the past 15 years, it sort of makes sense because they they're using, obviously, I cannot say that as a reporter, but I have to be more careful about that. But that's a proof. That's sort of like a proven fact, and it's well known that the judiciary is being used by the ruling party to, I mean, jail opposition activists and dissenters and human rights advocates, but you cannot speak anything against the judiciary, because then will you have the risk of contempting the court. So so what I'm trying to say, I mean, if you consider politics as a game of thrones, pun intended, so the Awami League has covered all the bases and they have sort of won it. And they have been successfully able to neutralize their main oppositions in such a way that even before a national election, when all of their main leaders are languishing inside the jail, people are not that bothered about it. I mean, even if they're bothered, they cannot do much about it because there are so much constraints in every sectors. Like even as a journalist, we are sort of feeling reluctant to report what is happening outright, because we feel that if we write it, we might become a victim of various acts, namely digital security acts and other acts, because we don't know how we could provoke the ruling parties. And it's not always about the ruling parties. I mean, it's not like that the journalists are who are having a dissenting voice are having a hard time because of the ruling party leaders and stalwarts. No, it's like the local level leaders. They have the scope of lodging of cases against any journalist or any people whom they find saying some, I don't know, offensive terms or offensive speeches in online spaces. So you never know what happened, what will happen to you. So again, if I have to talk about the upcoming election, as a reporter, I can say that it's not something that even Awami League is proud of. I talk with few Awami League leaders and local activists, and even grassroots level activists. They say that okay, they are not finding it very festive because election is a festive thing. If I remember correctly, the last great festive election that we had was in 2008, and I remember the festivity around that time. People, after 2 years of military-backed caretaker government, they had their moment of joy to witness a democratic transition again, and it was festive. And I normally own that fair and square. Maybe I don't know. There are controversies about that election. But since then, there is the election. You say that 2014, even 2018 election, which I covered in 2014. 2018, before the 2018 election, there were obviously even at that time the opposition, I mean the BNPs, were steamrolled by the ruling party activists and the bureaucracy and the judiciary and other arms that the government is using to suppress the oppositions. But then again, it was nobody knew that the 2000 election would be like that. Like we were sort of like taken aback on the election day. Anyway, but this time it's not like there is an election. I didn't feel that. I mean, yeah, from December 18, the Awami League leaders and politicians are on the road. You will see a lot of news like they are conducting their campaigns and everything. But somehow there is some sort of uneasiness among them. They know that they are not playing a fair game here. They don't have any fair oppositions. They don't have any strong oppositions. And without that, there is no glory in it. So, I mean, they know that they're doing they probably know that they're doing something wrong. But on the face of it, I mean, if you talk with some of the politicians, they're very adamant that they're not doing anything wrong. Rather, it's BNP who has made mistake by not participating in this election and by succumbing and by resorting to the violence and arson according to their speeches. So that's like the ground report from me. Just as I said, I strictly speak as a reporter here. I don't like to play the role of a political analyst, which I'm not.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that overview, Faisal, and we'll give you a chance to be on the other side in the question and answer as well. And our participants will get to ask you questions instead of you usually asking the questions. Now we'll turn to Dr. Titumir, who will provide us an overview of the economic context in which these events are taking place. So over to you, Dr. Titumir.
Thank you. Thank you. The understanding between politics and economics has to be understood in terms of Bangladesh's struggle, because as we all know that we had to witness two serious bloodshed, 1947 and 1971, which means there is a struggle to and the right to shape their life. And that's the essence of the Bangladeshi people. So if we are looking in that perspective, then we can really come up with certain propositions which hold because of the evidences that we have gathered over the years. So the first thing that I would touch upon is that about how misinformation and disinformation shapes up a narrative, and that by doing that narrative, how something could be legitimized. So if you really look at, I could give you many examples, but let's get an example in terms of food self-sufficiency. In 2014, 50,000 tons of rice was exported to Sri Lanka at a price of $225. That got huge report in media. But what has not been reported in the media is during the same year, 1.3 million tons of rice was imported at an average price of $300. Simultaneously, if you really look at, say, for example, why there is a balance of payment crisis, it's because of the external factors. But if one looks at the Bangladesh Bank, which is the central bank, and its statistics, one would have serious question about what is the cause of it, and would end up in having that this is because of the internal factors that has contributed ever dwindling foreign exchange reserve, then the devaluation of local currency against the dollar and other currencies. Say, for example, at the end of the June 2021, there was a phenomenal rise in terms of our imports. Normally, Bangladesh's imports are around, say, 55 to 60 billion dollars. But that particular year, there was a huge upsurge, a quantum lift of $82.5 billion. So where did that money go? So that's a logical question, but central bank has never done any forensic audit in terms of finding out where that money has gone. And if you really look at next year, at the end of the June 2023, then the Export Promotion Bureau is saying that there has been an export of $55.6 billion. But then again, Bangladesh Bank is saying that they have received $43 billion. Where is that unaccounted $12 billion? So there is a culture of, I would rather call it an impunity in terms of not providing the citizens with the where that money has gone. And there has not been any forensic audit in terms of really trying to find out the allegations about the capital flight. Or if you really look at, then even the IMF is also complicit in it, that they would be saying that in terms of Bangladesh, debt GDP ratio is still moderate, so one should not be worried about it. But what is to be worried? Because if you really look at Japan or America, the debt GDP ratio is very high, but that has any problem. But if you really look at in case of Bangladesh, then what one would find that during this period, 2009 to till now, the increase in terms of foreign debt is 322%. So it was 25 billion till 2009. Now it is $100 billion. So where did that go? And how would the country would be financing it? And for the first time, the country witnessed a negative balance in terms of financial account. What one has to really look at is not about tax GDP ratio. Rather, one would have to really look at that whether Bangladesh has an income that could pay back the debt. If you really look at that, Bangladesh is having one of the lowest tax GDP ratio in the world. In terms of South Asia, is just above Afghanistan with an 8%. So the amount that country has borrowed, that it would require 4 times. So, but what we see is narrative of development wonder, development surprise, development paradox, and a role model in terms of development. So one has to really look at it and how this information is creating a narrative that provides a kind of legitimacy. What Mr. Faisal Mahmood was earlier saying, in every news report, you would find that tagline saying the country is witnessing a kind of a miracle, but that cannot be empirically evident through use of Bangladesh government data. And then if you really look at in terms of concentration, centralization, and deinstitutionalization, I can go on giving many examples. Let's really look at the food security, and it's at risk. Bangladesh is witnessing prolonged food inflation, and if you really look at, then there has been in many parts of the world, the food price has gone down. But because of the rentier society, a syndicate system, what we are witnessing, that the money maker has really had a kind of a collusion with the rule maker. So the rent distribution is going on, and that has created a kind of a food insecurity. Food prices have decreased internationally, but very high in Bangladesh. Food import is also concentrated in terms of few countries, and there are volatilities, and food security is at risk, and it would continue, and it would have a dampening impact on the inflation in not only near future, but in the long run. Simultaneously, if you really look at the energy security, which is also at risk, if you really look at the government, the minister the other day was saying in the parliament, saying that the government has given 1.04 trillion taka as a capacity charge. Whether that electricity has been used or not, irrespective of that, because of the collusive contract, they are dishing away huge amount of money, and that too, 1/3 of it has gone to 3 companies. So look at how there has been a concentration of capital in a few hands, and that really provides the impetus to keep on clinging to the power. Then you would also see, and this story is known to everyone, and every day you hear this in newspaper in terms of the capital shortfall. Then there is no rule in the banking system. There is nothing in terms of disciplining the capitalists. And so what you see is a concentration, centralization, and institutionalization, where money maker and rule maker has created a resource dependent syndicate, which is vertically and horizontally linked, and perpetuating a system that really ensures that there are capital flight, as I mentioned in earlier case. And I would finish by the third point, which is whether there is a relationship between erroneous democracy and economic outcome. Why I'm saying erroneous democracy? Because if one really looks at the experiment between 1991 and 2006, nobody would claim that is a perfect democracy. But what one could see, that there has been an indigenous system that has created a kind of an understanding, because in Bangladesh, no political party has ever been able to hand over its power to another political party. And secondly, and most importantly, there has been an understanding that as if regime stability is political stability, which is not. But what the Bangladesh has been trying in terms of a homegrown agenda, in terms of correcting and perfecting that erroneous democracy. So if one really looks at the government statistics between 1991 to 2006 and beyond, one would see that there is a correlation. and the correlation is very clear, which is that in terms of all positive indicators, during the 1991 to 2006, there was an upward mobility. And in some cases, there were acceleration. But what we have seen in terms of after 2006, that there has been a deceleration, either in terms of poverty or employment creation or any other thing that you could imagine of. So which means that one could see that if there is a handover of power, that could ensure that positive progress can be sustained. And we have seen that in recent year, and that too coming from the government, in terms of household income and expenditure survey, we suggest that the poverty in Dhaka division, where the government has spent all highest amount, the poverty has increased. And if one really looks at, then there would be, in terms of social security, how it is in disarray. Health and education spending in real terms has declined. And what is more worrying is that private investment to GDP has stagnated. And over the years, and simultaneously you witness that there has been a decline in FDI. And if you really look at recent credit ratings by major credit rating agencies, they are putting us in negative territory, which would have a serious dampening effect on private investment. And if the investment isn't there, then how would you create employment? And how would you ensure that there is a decent employment, which would ensure people to fight against the prolonged cost of living crisis? So in short, that the visible hand has really restricted the invisible hand to function, and which has created the aspiration that Bangladesh has had. And my understanding is that, and my submission is that, if there is a political settlement where people has, or the median population has say, then obviously Bangladesh could achieve $1 trillion economy by 2031. So I would end here.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Titimir, for that comprehensive and sobering overview. Before I turn to our next speaker, I just want to welcome those participants who've joined us, or those attendees who've joined us as the program has gone on. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We already have several questions teed up, but we'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. So with that, I will now hand over to Carolyn Nash from Amnesty International. Carolyn?
Thanks so much. I think I'll be a bit brief because we have a pretty solid summary of what's been going on so far, and just maybe briefly I'll go through some of the issues that Amnesty's been tracking and will continue to track. But Faisal, I think, summarized most of what these are. Concerns around the mass arrests and the mass sentencing of opposition leaders, particularly since the rallies at the end of October, people who have been killed and injured during those arrests, the use of excessive force, also the indication that there's coordination between Awami League and the police, and the Prime Minister's comments that have fueled this environment of violence. It's also, concerning that so many of the charges are clearly without merit. People are abroad or in the hospital or deceased at the alleged time of the offense. And then in addition to the arrests themselves, we've seen mass sentencing. So opposition leaders and activists sentenced very recently, sometimes with cases that were years old, which brings into question the independence of the judiciary. So I guess more broadly than the last couple of months, there are some other issues that Amnesty has been tracking that relate to the threats to civil society that have kind of enabled this environment, including the Digital Security Act and the Replacement Cybersecurity Act, which retains many of the provisions that were used to target journalists and human rights defenders. We've also been targeting the increased targeting of diaspora populations, so family members of the diaspora, people who speak out, sometimes people who are based in the US who are speaking out, have had their family members targeted in Bangladesh. So based on the trends that we're seeing, there are a number, I'm going to maybe pivot a bit to the kind of response, the potential response. There are obviously, we push governments to make expressions of concern, both about the arrests, the sentences, the abuse of laws. Historically, even before the last couple of months, we've pushed governments to express concern with the laws that are kind of systemically abused in these ways to silence dissent. And those calls still stand. But I want to point out, one of the things that Faisal was describing was this environment where opposition leaders and activists recognize that they're in a position of extreme vulnerability and they feel hounded by police, that they know if they speak out, they're at risk. To some extent, we've seen the U.S. make some of the calls that we've pushed them for, and we've also seen a pretty extreme backlash on that effort. And so there's a way in which we're used to seeing evidence of a chilling effect on a civil society front, wherein a government or uses a law to go after sometimes a specific activist or organization with the intent of really kind of shutting down or at least dampening in an extreme way the entire civil society environment. And to some extent, I worry that we're seeing a diplomatic version of that with Bangladesh right now, where it's very difficult to pull the allies that we need to back up the U.S. And to strengthen the calls that the U.S. has made when it's clear that there's such kind of overpowering backlash and negative reaction to some of the things that have been said. So, part of this is a numbers game. Part of this is getting more voices applying this pressure, but it's also has to be a question of better coordination, getting governments to work together in a more intentional and strategic way to understand how they're getting these messages across. And being transparent with each other about what those mechanisms look like, where different governments are perhaps better placed, and at what level there's a willingness to engage, because this ultimately probably needs to be elevated in a pretty rapid way if there's any room to have any kind of positive effect on it right now. But maybe I'll pause there and hand over to John to take it from there.
Great, thank you very much, Carolyn. So as mentioned, our next speaker is John Sifton, the Asia Advocacy Director from Human Rights Watch. So John, over to you to pick up on the points Carolyn raised and to take it in whichever direction you want to go.
Sure. I mean, I'll be as brief as I can. I just want to emphasize that there is this political crisis and it's not going to get resolved favorably. I mean, so just to back up for a second, obviously Human Rights Watch, like most civil society groups and Amnesty and the rest, is not partisan. And in fact, many years ago, we wrote reports about the Rapid Action Battalion when the BNP was in power. And in fact, they created the Rapid Action Battalion. So we don't take sides in the election. I want that to be clear at the outset. But let's be very clear. Our biggest human rights concern right now is that the BNP leadership and most of its senior members have been either arrested or charged, and essentially they've had their leadership basically decommissioned. They're all in prison or under charge and threat. And the BNP has made it pretty clear that they're going to boycott the election. There was a disingenuous offer by Awami League to let all of these people out of prison in exchange for the BNP participating in the election, which simultaneously essentially proves how politically motivated all the arrests and prosecutions are, but also was called as a bluff by the BNP, who said that their underlying demand is that the election be held under a caretaker government, and that's not going to happen. So all that to say that the future here is not exactly murky. I mean, we don't know exactly how things are going to play out, but we don't have to wait and see. We know that this is not going to be a full, fair, and free democratic process that reflects the wills, democratic aspirations of the Bangladeshi people. So then the questions that we're answering right now about where do we go from here is really about what anybody, other governments, civil society groups, what journalists can say, do to impact the behavior of the Bangladesh government, such as it is, run by Awami League, about civil society and democracy after the election in the next 5 years, but also about violence. And that's really where we get down to brass tacks. Unfortunately, when we, see, it's not that I'm giving up on anything. I just want to be clear that the priority right now is on the rights of Bangladesh citizens not to be killed, not to be subjected to unlawful arrest, arbitrary arrest without due process. And so really, our primary concern right now is to pressure governments to pressure Bangladesh not to be as violent and as arbitrary in their detentions and prosecutions as they are, and essentially convince them somehow to compete electorally now. They won't, but in the future, in a fair way, and not in this unfair way and in this way, unsighted way that undermines the whole democratic legitimacy of their nation. But then the question is, does anybody care? Are there outside governments that care? And I think Carolyn was raising this concern, is that the United States government has been quite vocal, but they have been alone. And can we get other governments to coordinate with them to be stronger in their messaging? And there's no good reason why they shouldn't be, because as Dr. Tidamore said, the country's going to go broke. There isn't enough revenue in the next few fiscal years to pay for the enormous amount of debt that's coming online. And what that means is that outside governments, not just China, have a lot to offer in terms of potential economic assistance to prevent that debt burden from cascading out of control. But then there's also just the simple fact that Bangladesh's export market, such as it is, has enormous, part of the pie is the EU, the UK, and the United States. And if the tariff reductions that those countries give were conditioned on human rights and labor rights, as they are supposed to be in most scenarios, although in the US it's a little bit complicated for various reasons, that would be leverage that could be used to compel Bangladesh's government and its prime minister to change their behavior. But we don't really see any indications that the EU and the US are prepared to explicitly invoke that leverage. And I understand why. It sounds hegemonic. It sounds, like a mobster talking to criminals, mobster talking to ordinary people, throwing your weight around like that. But at this moment, when we're at risk of mass violence, if BNP manages to successfully conduct strikes that actually imperil the underlying mechanisms of the election, I think it isn't crazy to ask EU leadership, EU individual countries, but the EU foreign policy leadership, the UK and the US, to speak with other like-minded governments and try to get India too, as a regional voice, to express strong concern about the situation and about the risk of violence in particular, and perhaps save a few lives, keep a couple thousand people out of prison, and try to rescue the situation for another day when a democratic process that actually does reflect the will of the Bangladeshi people can be held. But I'm a little bit pessimistic about that, because the EU, except for the EU Parliament, the European Parliament, has been very quiet, and there's no reason to suspect that they're going to start getting noisier now unless there is some very, very outrageous violence. I just want to end on a prognosis about the violence. We don't know what's going to happen, but it is clear that so many BNP leaders and members are in prison that it isn't clear that the type of cartel and boycott and other protest events that took place in 2013 and 2014 could be mounted this time around because of the leadership, vacuums on the ground. But if something does happen, there is a risk for it getting even worse, both in terms of violence and arrests. And Sheikh Hasina and her security forces have a record of using the week between Christmas and New Year's as a time when a lot of other governments are on vacation or otherwise occupied with holidays. And, that's when we could see, worsening events, but perhaps not. And if not, then, again, I think a lot of governments are asking, what do we do after January 7th? And I know what the right thing to do is, but I guess what I'm reporting here is that right now we're at Human Rights Watch quite pessimistic about getting governments to do the right thing and call out the situation for what it is, an undemocratic process that doesn't reflect the will of the Bangladesh people. And then, push the government to begin stepping back from all this repressive behavior and setting the stage, for the day someday when there can actually be an atmosphere that works for democratic processes. So I'll leave it there, and we can perhaps answer more questions.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you to all of our panelists for your contributions. Bill, I will turn to you first. If you have any comments on what you've heard or any questions that you'd like to direct to any of the participants before I go to the questions from our attendees.
Well, thank you, John. I have a lot of questions came up. I thought it was the most fascinating discussion I've heard on all of our webinars and other events. And I must compliment the speakers for being extremely candid and extremely pointed in their comments. I thought it was very helpful. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to make a comment, which basically is somewhat follows upon Mr. Sifton's remarks, because I've been thinking along these lines for quite a while, but clearly the outcome, I mean, there will be something called an election, and there will be an outcome. And the outcome, it looks pretty right now, pretty much already in place. It will be a move towards another move towards complete authoritarianism, I think, in Bangladesh, with all the highlights that people have mentioned as possibilities. And what is not so clear, what is not clear in my mind, again, this echoes Mr. Sifton, excuse me, is how our governments, mine and others, will react, and what will they do? There are a number of ways they could try and defeat the situation, if you will, by trying to find ways to move Bangladesh back from its authoritarian posture. But there's also the possibility, which is loud and clear in my mind, of doing nothing and just, there are so many other problems in the world that we're dealing with, that who can be bothered with Bangladesh and other countries of that sort. So I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and it moves me again to say that I think our job, the job of the right to freedom and of the organizations that the speakers represent, to start thinking about how we will dialogue with the government of Bangladesh as it turns to into a more authoritarian kind of government over the after this next election, which I think is absolutely likely, and how whether we do have the grit, if you will, to do something which would be aimed at reversing slowly but surely, I'm sure, the situation and the outcome, actually. So that's sort of my comment, and I'll leave you with that. But I thought really this discussion was fascinating and really, really remarkable.
Thanks, Bill, and we'll come back to you at the end. So for the panelists, we had a couple of questions which were on the topic of voter turnout. It seems that as was mentioned, the voters aren't going to have much of a choice in terms of who to vote for. in terms of parties, but they do have the choice, theoretically at least, of whether or not to go out and vote. So maybe Faisal, we'll start with you and then open it to the other panelists, both in terms of what do you expect to see in terms of voter turnout, and what kind of turnout do you think is necessary for the election to be seen as legitimate by the people of Bangladesh? So Faisal, to you first, and then I'll open it up to others.
About voter turnout, obviously, Awami League is trying their best to make sure that the election will see some voters. Not some. I mean, they want to make sure that the election will see a lot of voters, and that they're putting dummy candidates, and they are making sure that the Jatiya Party, another big party, has taken part in the election. And I don't agree with BNP's, claim that if there is a free and fair election, Awami League will not be able to secure even 10 seats, because that's wrong. As I said, like, I just came back from a reporting trip from the southern part of Bangladesh, and I found that the voter base in that part is very strong for Awami League. So, yeah, in Bangladesh, this is a two-party, like most of the countries, this is a two-party country as well, and Awami League has its own voter base, which is pretty strong. Anti-establishment stance obviously plays its role in all the elections in Bangladesh. But then again, those who support Awami League will continue to support Awami League, and they will they will go to the polling booths, and they will cast their votes just to make sure that the media and mostly the media and other other social media will show lot of people gathering in the polling centers, and it will look good for Awami League in front of the whole world. But if you consider the common people's mindset, especially in the urban areas, I think the voter turnout will be very low. In the countryside, I think they will be able to make sure that the voter turnout will be high, especially in the districts which have strong Awami League supporting base. But in the urban areas, I don't think people have sort of taken this election as I would say selection. I mean, it's a selection. It's not an election anymore. They know that who is going to win. If someone has the ticket of Awami League and the symbol of boats, they're surely going to win, because there is a strong opposition candidate. So I think the voter turnout, my assumption is that the voter turnout will be quite good in the countryside, especially in the strong Awami League districts. But in the urban area, especially in Dhaka and like Chittagong, I don't think the voter turnout will be good.
Great. Thank you, Faisal. Would anyone else like to comment on that issue before we move on?
Yeah, I would just say that, like, without in any way legitimizing the process, because everything I said stands, that this is not a free and fair democratic atmosphere in which BNP could compete even if they wanted to. But if they're going to boycott, then that's especially not a democratic exercise. I mean, you can say what you will about a decision, but it certainly isn't a reflective situation of the will of the people of Bangladesh. Problem I'm worried about is that governments around the world, in an effort to not have this whole sham interfere with their regional priorities, their military, defense, economic interests, and everything else, will engage in mendacity to gloss this over. And you'll see EU governments, if not the EU itself, essentially blaming BNP for the whole situation and saying, yes, it wasn't legitimate because BNP didn't contest. And that is a grossly ignorant statement, because it doesn't reflect what BNP's underlying complaints were. It doesn't reflect the fact that 10,000 people were put in prison or more. But that's the mendacity that we can see from some EU governments that deal with countries like Cambodia and even Myanmar before the coup, to sort of look past severe democratic shortcomings to justify trade deals, and defense partnerships.
Great, thank you, John. So I'm going to take our next question from an anonymous attendee and broaden it just a bit. The question has to do with, again, the fear that journalists face when they're reporting. And again, Faisal, you referred to this in your comments. But I'd like to broaden it for Faisal, Dr. Titumir, and Mushfiq, I'm going to put you on the spot as well, putting on your journalist hat. And as an expatriate who has faced harassment and whose family has also faced harassment, could you comment a bit about what makes this situation perhaps unique in Bangladesh's history in terms of the level of pushback from the regime that whether it be journalists, academics, or others face? So Faisal, I'll start with you, and then Dr. Titumir or Mushfiq, if you want to comment.
Mm. If the question is about the fear of life for journalists, I think Bangladesh is not such a bad country. I mean, if you search like in the Google, like top 10 worst countries or top 10 countries where journalists were murdered, I think Bangladesh is not there. I think you'll find countries, obviously this year you'll find Palestine, and on a regular year, you'll find countries like Mexico, probably Afghanistan. But Bangladesh has the repression on journalism or journalists is very unique in Bangladesh. I mean, if you look at the past 15 years, I think for the most part of it, journalists are doing what we call self-censorship. I mean, they're not writing the reports that really matters and that really portray the real situation because they're doing the self-censorship. There are several reasons behind that. But most notably, obviously, the acts, the Digital Security Act now, which is called Cyber Security Act. Previously, it was ICT Act. You don't know what you will say on the online space or write on the online space will be used against you. And I think since 2018, as of now, more than 340 cases were lodged under the DS against the journalists, and I think around 230 journalists were sued. So, and if you look at the grounds basing on which they're being sued, it's so flimsy. I mean, anyone can file any case against you, and you didn't have, and that the worst part is that you are not even given bail, you're refused bail on many occasions. So yeah, I mean, again, there's no life threat for journalists, I believe, but there are other, as I said, like they're being thrown to the jails, and their families, I mean, they're facing financial ruins because of being in the jail. So this sort of repression is obviously very prevalent in Bangladesh.
Thank you. Dr. Titumir, would you like to comment on issues related to either academic freedom or the role of civil society in the current environment?
Thank you. What is really worried us, most of the people, which is not being discussed at all, is the risk, vulnerability, and sliding down to the crisis of the most of the citizens, as we are undergoing serious, prolonged cost of living crisis. And that has not been reported the manner in which it should have been done. Rather, what we have witnessed, a kind of a disinformation. So if one really looks at that, in case of Bangladesh, which is a food net importing country, and if there is only one thing in terms of monetary variable really works is exchange rate volatility. And if you are witnessing that, meaning you have a 30% decrease in terms of your salary, if you are a salaried income, then imagine a situation, and the Prime Minister in one of our exchanges mentions about famine. So the risk, the vulnerability, while the country would have huge potential in terms of really being a role model. So the gap, the missed opportunities, the missed potential has really landed in the few. And that created an atmosphere, because people are really, for right reasons, talking about civil and political rights. But what is not being discussed is economic, social, and cultural rights. And because one has to really look at the history. This is the single country in whole of South Asia which has shed blood to earn its independence. And that too in terms of three major or founding pillars: equality, human dignity, and social justice. I'm sure I'm not really saying that that those to be mutually exclusive. What is really important is to really demonstrate and look at the assumption and projection that are coming from IMF based upon if you really look at the data, that doesn't give you that kind of a projection. But unfortunately, nobody is acting on, because if you do not know what is the evidence, and even if you really do not really look at, say, for example, in case of World Bank, has they really looked at and asked a question that why this amount of investment has been done to Dhaka division, and why, because this household income expenditure survey is done with the technical assistance of the World Bank, and why the poverty has increased. I have never seen that question being asked, because what I am saying, we are not one party or the other. What we are really interested in looking at aspiration that has been in terms of our war of liberation. And secondly, you can't have a policy making where you do not know what is the figure, because everybody has asked question about the population, size of the population, but people are very happy in terms of saying that this has had per capita income of that. And if you really look at the international news agencies, they are providing a line saying Bangladesh has done miracle, as if now they are witnessing something different. So this disinformation campaign, I do not know, because I am not an expert on that. Faisal and others can be saying, is it because of there are perceived threat or something, or why? I do not know why the international agencies like World Bank, IMF, or Asian Development Bank to a greater extent is silent on the manufacturing of this data and the narrative.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Titimir. Mushfiq, would you like to speak a little bit about
Yeah.
the issue about expatriates?
Thank you, John, and thank you. According to Press Freedom Index, Bangladesh position is 163 around the globe, even 6 out of the 180 countries, even 6 steps behind in war-torn Afghanistan. And it is worse in South Asia, Bangladesh position. And as we are talking, Bangladesh, everything is managed election, managed media, managed journalism. So you have to be in Bangladesh. If you see, for instance, if you go to here I am practicing my free journalism, I can ask any question, whether they may like it or not. But if you go to Bangladesh Prime Minister's press conference, it's like a party conference. Nobody is asking question, even those who are joining, when they are asking question, at the same time, they are replying the question to make the hard, is kind of, what I should say, the People's Republic of Bangladesh is no more, because everybody is trying to happy the Prime Minister, is Her Excellency, or what is called in royal system, Her Majesty. So this kind of system in Bangladesh prevailing, and Bangladesh government claiming that they gave so many electronic media permission and media are free. Yeah, it's true, but it's just a propaganda machine. If you look in a talk show, in a Bangla TV talk show, you can see there is 3 people sitting just in front of the camera, 1 moderator and 3 person, and 1 from the opposition voice. So including moderator and the other speakers, everybody is attacking those who are representing from the opposition or who is from the difference opinion. So this propaganda machine in Bangladesh, they gave more than, I forgot the numbers, about 50 TV channel. So in Bangladesh, everything you are free. You can, but you can practice free journalism, but you have to speak for me. So this is, and the journalists, so-called journalists, they are compromising for their personal benefit or for their establishment. One of the topmost leading Bangla news, a newspaper editor, I don't want to mention his name, he said, I have to when he was talking that why you are shifting sometimes to the regime, he said, I have to maintain my newspaper. I have to pay the salary those who are working. So they are compromising in other way and around. So and those who are practicing journalism from outside, their family members, the Connaught Server sister was in 169 jail days in prison. Even their family facing harassment, intimidation by the regime and their people. So in Bangladesh, in terms of press freedom is nothing. Just people are, some news media, they are trying to say something, at least to rescue their readers or their viewers sometimes. But most of them, obviously, most journalists are Faisal Mahmoud and like others, those who are working in Bangladesh, yeah, they are under risk. And one, I need to, I can mention one thing. One editor, he wrote a piece, not a piece, they reported against the Prime Minister's son, Sajib Wajed Joy, the Amar Desh editor Mahmoud Rahman, and you observed his situation, how he is beaten up in front of the court, and he was in jail for months after months just for one report. So this is called in journalism in Bangladesh, and everything is managed. So I don't want to keep you long, and this is my personal opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Good. No, thank you, Mushfiq. So the next question, I'll turn to Carolyn and John. The question has to do with not just Bangladesh, but the broader context of increasing authoritarianism in other countries, and say the model that's being proposed by or being put forward by other authoritarian regimes. Can you talk a little bit about how you see developments in Bangladesh in the context of a broader assault on democracy and human rights around the world? And Carolyn, I don't know if you want to start, and then John.
Not really. John, you want to start?
Well, obviously, I mean, there was a question about India having any leverage here. I want to be clear that when I spoke of India as a potential government that would raise concerns, it wasn't because I believed that they embrace that the current Indian government is embracing democratic principles wholly, but rather because we would think that they would have a stake in wanting the election and the aftermath not to result in instability. And this, I think, links to the point that Dr. Hidamar was making, which is that this is all tied together with the economic situation. There is a pending economic crisis that would confront any government that would take power after this election. And the World Bank, unfortunately, and the IMF and most IFIs have a very poor track record in intervening before there is a major economic crisis, at least intervening in a effective way. It's usually only after you default on your domestic or international debt or both that all of a sudden the IMF comes in and starts talking to you about not just your revenue, but your corruption and all the other problems of good governance. So that's a situation we have here. I mean, there's all this potential leverage that governments that fund the World Bank have to voice their concerns about the deteriorating governance of Bangladesh. Forget Awami League, forget BNP, just the deteriorating institutions, democratic institutions, rule of law institutions, the fact that labor rights are very important and haven't really developed. Over politicized. I mean, all of this stuff is contributing. Corruption, I think a country that is developing from severe poverty can get away with some systemic corruption at the beginning of their growth rates, but it's not great down the line for your economic model. Unless it's a very tailored, concise form of corruption, such as you see in like Vietnam or something. What it usually does is it usually ends up dragging down your economy, as well as, of course, any good governance you have. Corruption is the enemy of democratic processes and sustainable economic growth. And Bangladesh is about to fall off an economic cliff because of its poor governance. So I think the IMF and its funders have plenty of leverage. But unfortunately, we've seen again and again, and we've seen it most recently in the region with Sri Lanka, IMF and its funders don't get involved until the crisis is already upon you and people are eating once a day. And there's a foreign currency reserve crisis and a balance of payments crisis that spun out of control, and ultimately an international and domestic debt crisis that crimps the lending. And then as soon as the lending's gone, the whole merry-go-round ends. So it's all tied together. I agree, but it doesn't really get us anywhere on the election itself. It's more about how journalists and civil society can warn governments not to whistle past the graveyard, not to just bury their head in the sand and think, okay, well, it's stability. It's not stability. The massive debt load is not sustainable, and the good governance is not sustainable. Like, ultimately, it all explodes, and you can't keep everybody in prison forever.
I guess maybe if I can, moving a bit away from the economic side of things, in terms of the question about it being a regional trend, I mean, one of the things that stands out to me, and this has come up both in the questions and a little bit inside of some of the discussion, is this issue of how much, I mean, I don't think it's been said directly, but essentially how much political capital the US or other governments are going to spend to try to influence things. And I guess what I see if I look at other Sri Lanka, also Myanmar, also Thailand, frankly, where there are real concerns about governance and democracy, is the sense that the US in particular, because that's where I focus, but that these governments that we in this industry tend to turn to don't have the political will, also don't have the capacity, and increasingly don't have the credibility to be particularly effective in this kind of influence. That isn't happening. And so I think moving to a recognition of what it means when you are losing some of that way of change, of influencing change, really does mean rethinking what we're talking about when we're talking about local civil society and local journalists and how we're connecting those communities. I think we're probably moving away more and more from a game of having governments influence one another, because it's not working, and the cracks in credibility across the board, all governments, are just more and more apparent, not in a kind of side conversation, but as a mainstream recognition that a lot of our geopolitical reality is just entrenched hypocrisy. And at a certain point, that means we have to start looking for leadership to come from other corners. And that's where I would go to local civil society, particularly alliances that start up between these countries that are facing this more directly, and also local journalists who I saw a question in there about what journalists should cover. I think that's an interesting question, but I think those are the two camps that, long term, we really need to be looking for leadership models that are capable of addressing this trend in a way that I'm simply not sure that that traditionally thought of powerful governments are even capable anymore.
Great, and thank you for picking up those threads about journalism and civil society. I want to take
Can I
advantage
actually add on that, John?
Oh, sure,
I mean,
please,
that's absolutely it right there. I mean, what I was proposing is a very ham-fisted, top-down, sort of hegemonic approach where the IMF comes in and says, you need to clean up your corruption and adopt better reforms to your political sector and all the things they're doing in Sri Lanka, not very successfully, I may add. Is that a recipe for success? No, it's not. It's definitely not. But it may be all that you got, because the governments, they don't have any credibility. The United States government has been losing credibility for decades now because of various military adventures and hypocrisies around the world, but now more than ever. And the EU, its credibility is tenuous at best. And the UK, to some degree, just simply because of the large population of Bangladeshi British citizens and the connections between the governments at a political level, may have some leverage, but certainly no credibility. And so where is the credibility going to come from for any of these discussions? It's going to come from civil society, as Carolyn said, and from journalism.
Great, thank you, John.
And academia, excuse me.
No, please, thanks. So I want to take advantage of having Faisal and Dr. Titumir to get an on-the-ground perspective on one aspect of U.S. policy that has come up in the questions and has been discussed, and that was the U.S. announcement of visa sanctions for those undermining the election process. So Faisal, if you could speak to how this action has been perceived on the ground, and then Dr. Titumir, if you could also pick that up with a specific focus on business confidence and how the business community looks at these issues related to sanctions and their own vulnerability. So maybe Faisal, to you first to talk more broadly about how the U.S. visa policy has been received on the ground.
Okay. First of all, let me state one facts clear. US is very popular in Bangladesh right now. I mean, even in the villages, they're talking about US. And I can give one example, like when Hamas attacked Israel and there's this massive retaliation from Israel on Palestinian people and the ongoing things that can be in any sense called a genocide. In Bangladesh, when something happens in Palestine, you usually see a lot of people coming out from our main central mosque in Dhaka called Baitul Mukarram, and they're burning flags of US and Israel together. But I'm not sure like whether I have seen any US flags being burned in the past 1 month, and that's very strange because you usually express your grudge against the US. So that probably says that how popular is US right now in Bangladesh. And why they're being popular? Because I mean, they have taken a stance, well, sort of stance to make sure that democracy is being restored in Bangladesh. And again, the visa policy that they declared was not specifically for Bangladesh, but I mean, yeah, it was specifically for Bangladesh, but it was applied against countries like Nicaragua, Cambodia, right? So first, initially, here I'm not stating my own opinion. Rather, I would say I am aggregating the opinions that I've heard from the political analyst and giving a spin on of my own. And that my version is the US visa policy worked initially, and people were scared that they might, because it's an open-ended policy, right? They don't know against whom US is going to apply it, so they were scared. But what I've heard that the ruling party leadership sort of like told their field levels activists and mid-level activists that, listen, you're not going to go to US anyway, so why don't you stay in Bangladesh and do whatever you're doing even in a more intense way. So it sort of backfired, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Now people are not that afraid of US visa policy anymore. That again, that's what I'm saying, this as a reporter and what I've understood from the ground. But maybe it's not, because there's a lot of geopolitical issues. And I had just finished writing a story on the possible economic sanction on the garments and RMG sector, economic sanction on the RMG sector. And I found that the BGMA leaders and the industries and even the Awami League peoples are very relaxed about it. They're pretty sure that any sort of economic sanctions will not fall into the garment sector because it doesn't make any sense. US on one hand try to promote, make sure that the labor's rights are being protected in Bangladesh. But if any economic sanction fall onto the shoulders of Bangladesh, the most affected people will be the laborers. And that's not me saying so. That's like the BGMA leaders and Awami League have this notion. So they're not at all worried about it. So I'm not sure how.
Yeah, and they shouldn't. US visa. I mean, it's an empty threat. The EU will never.
Yeah, right. So exactly, EU will never do that. I'm talking about US. So you know what I mean. So since as I was saying, like the Awami League leaders, the ruling party, I would say ruling party leaders and the BGMA leaders all know that. So they are not that worried about it. That's my opinion.
I think the thing about the sanctions that's always difficult is that they were there's two types of sanctions. There's the Magnitsky sanctions against RAB named people, and then there's visa restrictions, which are unnamed, but are said to be anybody and everybody. And they only have the potential to impact a very narrow segment of the security services, the ones who would have something to be gained by having the capacity to travel or engage in economic transactions in US dollars. And that's primarily the leadership, the officer corps of the security forces who might someday in their career serve as peacekeepers for the United Nations and things like that. And for them, it's serious business. You don't want to be involved in RAB. You don't want to be involved in disappearances if it means you can't travel to the US, you can't receive peacekeeping training, you can't visit your relatives in the United States. And if it was done in the European Union, the European Union. But one of the points we made to the EU in a letter this summer, along with some other human rights groups, was precisely that we don't support sanctions on the economic sector, which would impact the economy writ large and millions of workers, even though the privileges that you're giving them are conditioned on human rights. And technically, you should withdraw those privileges, which isn't a sanction, it's just a withdrawal of privileges. Technically, you should do that, but we're not advocating that. But if you're not going to do anything about that, even though these privileges are being given without being earned, then the least you can do is match the United States, which is going after this abusive military and security force, the Rapid Action Battalion, and maybe save a couple lives. Because RAB will still arrest people, they'll still beat people up and torture people. They still are doing that. But the number of extrajudicial killings did go down. And that is something. It's not something that we should, sing too many praises about, but it's not nothing.
Great, thank you, John. Dr. Titimir, just to broaden it a little bit, do you have any comments on the business community and business confidence in this current environment?
Now, there are two issues. One, if there is an individual sanction, that would have a limited impact. But what is more worrying, if there are industry-wide sanctions or withdrawal of certain facilities, like as we know that the GSP facilities has been suspended by the United States for quite some time due to labor rights issues. In case of European Union, where RMG we have overtaken China as a top exporter. So RMG by itself has not been able to show that they are there because of the competitiveness, because the leverage, because of the Everything But Arms initiative, it allows Bangladesh to enjoy the duty-free, quota-free access. So that would have a disastrous impact. And given particularly the fact that our export has decelerated, the growth has gone down, and remittance earning is not showing any positive trend. So if those two are, because if you have a continuous negative outflow and then you do not have a inflow, then the way now it is shaping, because for the first time in Bangladesh history that we are witnessing negative financial account, which has really had a negative balance of payment. And if it continues, and there are already payment crisis looming, in the sense that there are deferral. Even within the government agencies, one agency has not been able to pay the other. Or in terms of, say, our energy is import dependent. So if you can't really pay on the energy, if there is a deferment, then obviously there would have a serious implications. So that is really worrying if there are these kinds of things happen. It's not sanctioned, but if you are withdrawing the benefit in terms of as a part of the generalized system of preference, which is known commonly as GSP. And then again, if, say, for example, there are contingent processes like IMF has released its second tranche, but there are examples where IMF has not continued in terms of releasing the in installments. And then, but the interesting thing is that today, Asian Development Bank has released its December outlook. While it has downgraded in terms of growth forecasts, but it has not said what is that. So quite interesting, the play that you witness by the international financial institutions. But what is worrying me is that, because if you don't mend politics, you can't really recover from economic downturn. And that's worrying. I would have a discussion with you after 50 years with happy face, which I can't do. That is our problem. Someone who looks at the data and sees how, because if you remember that one time in Bangladesh, in a neon sign, and Faisal would tell you that there were neon signs saying, displaying that this is the foreign exchange reserve. And if you believe the government's statistics, this month it should have been $50 billion. Now we do not know, because we do not know what is our liability. So the discussion one has to really have in place about the huge potential this country exhibits as the 8th largest country in the world in terms of population size, and which has shown, even in erroneous democracy, that it may not match China, but but that has slowed down. And there is joblessness. So inequality is increasing. So you can't really say that, like giving the East Asian false dichotomy, saying that this type of developmental state has done better. No, the point in East Asia is that of disciplining capitalist. But if you really look at, take any example of bank from 2019 to onwards, then you would see how laws are really bent, or new acts or modifications are done to cater to the rentier society. It reminds us, and most of us are aware of the Louis XIV regime. So the rent distribution, which is accumulating to someone and creating a rentier society, and then, because it's not, I am not against or for, because this binary is not to me. But what is really important, look at the potential, the huge capacity to uplift people out of poverty even in a erroneous democracy. But that too is a democratic path. But what is now, because we do not know, and when risk becomes uncertainty, it's very difficult for an economist to predict, because you can manage risk, but you can't really deal with uncertainties. And that has a dampening effect on your business decisions. So I would stop here.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Titimir. John, did you want to jump in on that, or? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. Thank you to everyone who posed questions. I know there were some questions we didn't get to, but I think we've covered all of the thematic areas raised in the questions. Bill, I'll turn it over to you if you have any final thoughts or comments on the question and answer period or the broader program today.
Well, that's very kind of you, John, to turn it back to me again, because I've already said everything I probably can. But I would just want to say to the speakers and to the audience, thank you for coming. I think it's been a fascinating morning, and I'm very pleased with the way people did talk honestly and pointedly about things that I've been thinking about for some time. So beyond that, I'd say that I guess my role should be also, from not only myself, but from the right to freedom and from all the staff, I'd like to wish you all happy holidays and a very happy new year. And that's the end of it, John.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. And again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Mushfiq and the team for putting today together. We'll be posting the video from today, so that will be available on our normal channels. And we look forward to interacting with many of you in the future. So thank you very much.